guys, the Curious Owl here, and welcome back to Top 5 Wednesday. So this week's theme is to focus on books that may be better if you don't really know much about them, if you kind of go in not really knowing much of what the plot is. That way, either it doesn't delve too much into the plot and spoil anything, or it may just be interesting to kind of go into a story completely blind, because I know that I have done that quite a bit with several books, and I didn't really know much about what was going on in the book, but I really enjoyed it, despite that. So here are my top 5 choices for books that would be better to go in blind to. And number 5 is the first book in the Crank series by Ellen Hopkins, the book Crank. And although the title of the book and the cover may suggest exactly what the story is about, which is about meth, it doesn't really tell you anything about how the characters become involved with meth, which I really enjoy, because I remember reading this in high school and I kind of knew what Crank was. I knew it was meth, but I didn't know exactly what was going to go on in the story, because the back of the book didn't even really deliver any kind of synopsis, any true synopsis of what the plot of the story was going to be. And so I was very surprised going in and seeing how the story ended up progressing, and the fact that it was written in poetry. So for those of you who may be studying psychology, and especially, drugs and all that and how it affects the brain, and then those of you who may be involved with poetry and maybe a little bit on the older side, I think this would be really interesting for you to read, because you don't really see how the character is involved with meth until much later on in the story, and how over the rest of the Crank series this character and other sets of characters become involved with it or don't become involved with it. And it's just a really interesting story to delve into, as sad as it really is. And number 4 is the book Sing It to Her Bones by Marcia Talley. I did do a book review of this book quite a while ago. I think actually not this past summer, but the summer before I reviewed this book. And honestly, this was one of these books that I found at my public bookstore, and it was one of those blind date with a book things, and I really didn't know much about it. I remember the cover of the brown paper saying something that it was a mystery and that it involved a cancer survivor, and so I really knew nothing about this book going into, which I think this is a great way for you to kind of get into books that you don't really know anything about, is to do things like blind date with a book, where you go in, you read a little bit of what they offer you for the books, and then you just buy it, and then you figure out what it is and you read it. It's such an interesting way to be able to get yourself involved with different kinds of genres you may not be familiar with, especially if you don't even know what the book is. It was just such a cool idea, and I just remember reading the book and I was pleasantly surprised with how the story went. Although I didn't give it the best review in the world, I think that the story itself was really interesting, and it was not how I expected it at all. And number 3 on my list is another book that I found with the blind date for a book stall, basically, and that is the book Save Me by Christian Cusack Lewis. And I really didn't know much about this book going into it. I think I remember saying something about renewal and new starts and kind of betrayal, something along those lines. I don't exactly remember, because it was so long ago since that brown paper was on that book. But I remember going into the story not really, again, knowing much about it, just knowing these little things that seem to be overarching themes of the book, and I was very surprised with how much I really enjoyed this book, despite there being some problems. I did also do a book review of this, I think maybe earlier this summer. I don't remember off the top of my head. I want to say it was early in the summer. Number 2 on my list is one of my 2 John Green books I have picked for this list, and that is Will Grayson, Will Grayson. Now, I kind of knew the gist of what this story was about, but I still didn't really understand it. I remember one of my friends, before I had read it, kind of told me a little bit about it, but not enough to really spoil anything. And so I really just didn't know much about the story. All I knew really was that there were 2 boys that had the same exact name, and that was about it. I didn't know really anything else about, how they related or how they met, if they met at all. And I also have a book review for this one, which I will also leave in the comments below. And I was so surprised with how the actual story ended up, because it took such a weird turn after about the middle of the story, and I didn't exactly know how I felt about it. I definitely didn't like some of the characters that were involved with it, mostly the supporting characters, but the overarching main characters of the story really took a really interesting turn that I didn't expect them to. I kind of wish that I would have known a little bit more going into this one, but I still think that it is still enjoyable if you don't know much about it, except the fact that you know that there are 2 characters with the same name, time, and it's kind of their story, which I thought was probably the best amount of information I could possibly have gotten. And at number 1 on my list is my favorite John Green book that I talked quite a bit about on this channel in the past, and that is Looking for Alaska by John Green. I love this book so much. I actually did not only a book review on this book when I first started my channel, like I think it was one of my first 10 books I did. I also afterwards did a book talk with my best friend Erica, and I will leave both of those videos down in the description for you guys with all the other videos. None of my friends would tell me anything about this book when I asked them about it, and I thank them so much for it because I think I got so much more enjoyment out of this story and learned so much more, not just about the story itself, but about myself and how I interact with people and how I need to think about, you know, how I process what I think of people essentially from this book. And it was just it has such an amazing theme and message to it that I feel like transcends to all kinds of different people, no matter where you're from, no matter who you interact with. The types of messages that, you know, come through this story are so amazing, and it is why it is one of John Green's most famous books of all time, is because it has such a great message, and pretty much everyone in the YA universe knows about this book. But there you guys go, that is my top 5 list for books that are better without a synopsis and should be gone into blind. One honorable mention I would like to talk about is the book Sphinx's Princess by Esther Friesner. This was really hard to keep off of my top 5 list because it was such a good book, and that all I knew about it going into it was that it was placed in ancient Egypt and the main character was a girl. I didn't know anything else going into this book, and I love the history of Egypt so much that I was so interested in going into it when I was in middle school. And I just remember reading that, and its sequel, Sphinx's Queen, was such an amazing experience. It was really cool to not know much about what was going on because it led up to such a great reading experience for me. I think that's really the main point with this specific topic, is there are some books that just seem to be better for a reader's experience when there's no information on the synopsis or you don't know anything going into it. So I would recommend to those of you who may be getting into a new book, don't read the back of the book or don't read the dust jacket cover, because it may be better for you to read the story without having any idea of what the story is about, because you might get your hopes up for the type of story that it's talking about, and then when you read the book, it totally messes up everything you thought and you get disappointed. And I think that's the worst thing to happen to someone who tries to read a book that, you know, especially is supposed to be really popular. Just go into it not knowing really anything about it and tell me how your experience is with that. Let me know down in the comments below if you have read any books that you really didn't know about going into that you ended up loving, because I would love to hear some of your guys' thoughts on books that you read. But anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me in this Top 5 Wednesday video. I hope you guys really did enjoy it. If you did, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you're not already and you'd like to be, hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys!